Okay. So ready when you are.
Okay, so now I just do share screen. I should do this. And if I do this, does it work? Boom. So is everyone seeing the pretty flowers in the screen of the PowerPoint, just the full screen
Yeah.
of PowerPoint? Yeah. Nice. Okay. Okay. Gosh, it was a bit of an interesting exercise trying to figure out how to present this, to find the thread, and it really made me feel, you know, how Dupuy talks in right at the beginning about balancing American academicism and French intellectualism. Like it kind of have this sense reading through, like, oh yeah, this is what he's talking about, and then trying to reproduce it. It's like, oh, actually, it's hard to kind of find the narrative a little bit, or find a coherent narrative. And then, yeah, like we've said at previous meetings, there are many. It seems to be a tapestry of narratives and a tapestry of levels, and so I guess I'll point to what I picked out. I'm looking forward to talking about it. So yeah, there were these sections, and I think in the first case, these were the first sort of three themes that I picked out from the chapter. There were, in the first case, he was trying to show how there was an attempt to integrate biology and physics, and then what that meant and what implications that had for models and modeling in the context of the complexity of biology, and then the kind of not quite cryptic, but certainly implicit finale to the chapter where suggests that AI is this model of the model, and we're kind of a bit lost in the mirrors. So I wanted, because I wasn't here last week, so I wanted to kind of just connect it in any case with the previous chapter. So in chapter 3, 2 chapters before this, we have kind of the talk about the physicalist temptation. That chapter has a lot of connection. That shows up a lot in this chapter. And Carl Lashy's quote's kind of cool in this regard, that our common meeting ground is the faith to which we all subscribe, I believe, that the phenomena of behavior and of mind are ultimately describable in the concepts of the mathematical and physical sciences. And that cybernetics, if the truth be told, thought of itself as the apotheosis of physics. So that's kind of something that comes up in this 5th chapter a lot. And then there's McCulloch's question and challenge in chapter 3 of the Dupuy notes in chapter 3 of physics having to account for itself in the terms that it has available to it: energy, time, space, matter, and so on. And so yeah, there's the sense that, okay, maybe physics isn't going to be able to do what we need it to do here. Right. So in that regard, I thought there was maybe this other theme going on of physics and metaphysics, you know, because so the question of what place physics has in this discussion is a metaphysical question, and one that shows up in the movement to second order cybernetics. And then in the 4th chapter, there's, you know, on the philosophy stuff, there's a lot of talk about subjectless processes. I think, and for me, that was one of the biggest takeaways from the book as a whole. Like, oh, that's what's going on in the cybernetic movement. And then this, the kind of the background humanism is brought into question by the increasing sophistication of the machines and cybernetics. So as a whole, I think in this chapter, these are sort of the 5 themes or levels or threads or whatever that I think are going on. Like maybe be discussion points afterwards. So I'm just going to kind of go through each of the sections and what I understood and what I thought was relevant and interesting. So we start off that maybe cybernetics and physics are not in as much tension as might be thought, because in the same way that physics identifies isomorphisms between physical phenomena in terms of mass and energy and so on, Dupuy suggests that really in the end, cybernetics is just extending this practice of identifying isomorphisms across different phenomena, different forms. So isomorphisms of our nervous systems and logic and other features of mind. And Dupuy suggests that in this regard, information can kind of be a confusing concept. But yeah, he points out things like, yeah, it belongs to thermodynamics, where it's got this relationship to the notion of entropy, this question of order and disorder. And he points out that really what Wiener wanted was a physics of information, right? And I think what he's saying there is that we wanted physics, or it was this extension of physics and the methods thereof to cybernetics, that we wanted to be able to use these methods to describe cybernetic systems. And there's that nice quote that the most important characteristic of a living system is its awareness of the outer world. This means that it is furnished with organs of coupling to pick up messages from the outer world that condition its future conduct. To consider this in the light of thermodynamics and statistical mechanics is instructive. And the way I'm interpreting that is that, so thermodynamics and statistical mechanics, these physical means of describing the interaction of an organism with the outside world. So I think that's like, there's this sense that, oh, maybe we can actually do this. Maybe we can actually describe these systems just using physics. And information theory is a means of doing this, formalizing it. There's an interesting skepticism from this guy, Raymond Reuter. I can't remember exactly who he is. But Dupuy points out that Reuter says the theoreticians as well as the technicians of cybernetics are at bottom uninterested in anything that's not an immediate technical problem, and that they believe they don't have to be more philosophical than behavioral psychologists. And yeah, Dupuy goes on to say that actually I don't think that's quite right. He says that they were neither narrow-minded technicians nor the champions of a new science, but instead were really just scientists trying out a new tool, right? So maybe they weren't necessarily being like, right, with information theory and so on, we can extend physics into, but we're just really seeing how far this can go. That's a nice sort of diplomatic view, I guess. And in the second section, so we move from then this information theory to the second section on form, chance, and meaning, to just get into the notion of information a bit more. I included here a paragraph from Shannon's famous piece, A Mathematical Theory of Communication, where there's some kind of famous key phrases, where Shannon says, just reading from the top, the fundamental problem of communication is that of reproducing at one point either exactly or approximately a message selected at another point. Frequently, these messages have meaning, that is, they refer to or are correlated according to some system with certain physical or conceptual entities. But these semantic aspects of communication are irrelevant to the engineering problem. The significant aspect is that the actual message is one selected from a set of possible messages. I included this because it helps me make sense of the discussion of form, chance, and meaning later on, and also for distinguishing, finding the nuance where information is confusing. So come back. So the key there is that signal is this sort of choice of a signal rather than noise represents a choice amongst possible alternatives. And that as a choice amongst possible alternatives, it becomes possible to represent it as a quantity independent of its meaning. A kind of a pure difference, if you want, difference without content. And I wanted to note that Bateson was the guy that came up with the difference that makes a difference. And that's often the way information is understood, and that something like that is again independent of any of the content, like what the semantics or the meaning. And then just to say a little bit more about it, I wanted to note, so Wiener's cybernetics book in 1948, Control and Communication, the Animal and the Machine. Here, I think the significant thing and the connection is that we have an informational isomorphism between the animal and the machine, right? So in terms of information theory, we can describe both the behaviors of animals and machines. Boom, okay, we have this kind of united approach to describing cybernetic systems in mathematical and formal sort of terms. And I really like, so Aaron Sloman, philosopher, computer scientist, has a paper that's also really good on distinguishing control information and communication information. And I think this distinction is great for understanding where information gets confusing. So he talks about control systems that Wiener and others who were designing cybernetic systems, right? We need within a system, within a machine, in order for a machine to work, the communication of signals internal to the machine have to be high fidelity. And that's what Shannon calls the communication, right? When they're talking about communication, they're talking about this propagation of signals internal to the machine or internal to our nervous systems, and that if on one end of if a neuron on one end of my body is saying this, and then a neuron, and then the signal that's received on the other end says something completely different, then that's going to be a problem. I'm not going to be coordinated. My behavior is not going to be controlled. So I'm not going to be able to do anything. I'm not going to be able to achieve my goals. And so that control information, Aaron Sloman calls it, is that kind of quantitative, meaning independent one. Whereas communication is, he calls it, he describes it in terms of Jane Austen's letters. That's the more everyday, like, right, I'm trying to communicate the content of this chapter as I understood it to you. So those two different forms, as Sloman presents them, are very different kinds, right? So the control is the quantitative and the communication is the semantic. But Wiener and Shannon use both of those terms to describe the quantitative thing, and that's, I think, an important, and that's how it can be confusing. So I like Sloman's distinction there. So part of this means that chance and meaning are sort of sides of a coin. And so Marquis, I don't know who he was. I can't remember who this guy was. It says that the best communication occurs if you say what the listener expects you to say. Right? So very little chance. Whereas lick litter, lick lighter, says that the optimum is the balance between extremes. And then Dupuy goes on to quote von Furster, saying that the less redundancy there is in a language, the more information you can transmit. But the greater the redundancy, the more structured it is. So finding some kind of optimum between a balance, between the amount of redundancy that we want, which is to say, we come to this view of organization as a mix of order and disorder. Dupuy says that this is at the heart of second order. And then he has some nice quotes from Simondon. I'd be curious to hear if anyone's actually read much of Simondon. Following this book, I got his Fundamental Existence of Technical Objects. Holy heck, it was. I started it and I didn't get very far, basically. Anyway, Simondon has some nice quotes here. He says, information is midway between pure chance and absolute regularity. But information is not form nor a set of forms. It's the variability of form, the unpredictability of variation. not the pure unpredictability of variation in general. So the upshot here really is that, like, this holds for animals and machines, right? An information theory is a way of talking about this variation of forms. And so it becomes a basis for legitimizing what Simondon calls the initial postulate of cybernetics, that it identifies living beings and self-regulated technological objects as one. So yes, the chance is part of this information and meaning thing, but there are a lot of prejudices that people seem to have against the role of chance in meaning. And Dupuy says that this was really to do with differing conceptions of rationality. And it concerned the question of, is it possible to abstract from meaning in the way that information theory does, right? So information theory abstracts away from the meaning of the statements or of signals to their structure and quantity. And so to this question, there were, he says, two different sides at the conferences. So conceptions of rationality from economic rationality said, yes, it is possible to abstract from meaning into something called quantity. And so at the time, von Neumann and Morgenstern had published their book in '48 on game theory, and then somebody else had done some decision theory around the same time. And I think it's really important to note that both of these things are now the basis of, even, 70 years later, the basis of a lot of AI, the philosophical approach to building AI systems. What Russell and Norvig call in their textbook on AI, the modern approach, they call it the rational agent paradigms. Russell, in his 2019 book on the control problem, says, basically what we're trying to do when we build AI systems is build rational agents. And I think that's kind of significant, because with this kind of history of saying, yes, it's possible, with this kind of, if we trace this root of what rational agent means back, it's connected into information theory in this way that, like, it's possible to be rational in a way that understands rationality as independent of meaning, right? So we can do propositional logic and so on without content of any of the propositions, for example. So on the other side of the aisle, people say, no, it's not possible to abstract from meaning. Were Wiener, McCulloch, and Bateson, and they kind of, Dupuy says that McCulloch took every opportunity to critique utility theory for flattening components of desire and choice into a single dimension. And again, I want to say that, like, yeah, we see this also again in contemporary understandings of intelligence as far as AI systems go, where intelligence is kind of understood as this single dimension of problem solving capacity. So I don't know, it's like, oh yes, 60, 70 years on, these questions are, we're still, okay, people have taken up positions on them, but we haven't settled them. We haven't figured them out. Okay, so this next section on cooperation and cognition, this is where we start to see, he says, a connection between information and rationality. He says that it was explored through empirical work on cooperative situations, where Alexander Babila continued some work where the experiment, what was the experiment? So the experiment took the form of a group of people who had to write a number down on a piece of paper, and they knew that the sum of the numbers of the people in their group that they all wrote down had to be 17. And there were two ways that they conducted this. In the first case, the experimenter took the numbers and took the group's numbers and said, okay, here's what you hit. Here's the number you hit. And in the second case, the experimenter just said too high or too low. So it didn't specify the number. And then in due course, in the second case, so when the number wasn't specified, but they just said too high or too low, the groups converged on 17 faster in fewer steps. And so this kind of presented a problem or a challenge or a confusion for the group because the idea was that, okay, well, if I know what number I had, that's sort of more information than just go higher or lower. And so there were a couple of different explanations for what people at the time felt were curious results. So people like Shannon, Savage, and Bigelow thought that, well, it's just the group's just being it's just a rational group behavior. And Dupuy says, for them, the only conceivable rationality was that of the algorithm. Suppose one asks a machine to solve a particular problem. It's unimaginable that the machine would do less well if supplied with supplementary information. This is tantamount to saying that the value of an additional unit of information can never be negative. And then, so there were other theories. So Kubi, I think he was the psychotherapist, suggested that, well, maybe they're just non-conscious processes going. And then Babelas himself, the guy conducting the experiments, the explanation that he put forth is that, well, if we all here are trying to write down a number and collectively reach 17, and I don't know, say Sebastian tells us, okay, we've hit 20, then I go, all right, we all need to go lower, but heck, I know that everybody else is also going to be thinking that, so maybe I'm going to adjust my number accordingly, and so I'm trying to model other people's modeling, and we just get of group dynamics, and we get this kind of complex situation going on where it's too much information. Savage summary. So Savage, I can't remember what exactly his profession was, but so he said that in response to this, that throughout the existence of the group, we've been torn by two contradictory hopes. The one sustained by Turing's theorem, as the cyberneticians persisted in referring to it rather than thesis, that for anything humans can do, we will always manage to find a machine that can do it as well. The other hope is that we will finally discover something human that a machine cannot reproduce. And on the basis of that, then Dupuy moves into this fourth section on cybernetic totalities. I went through it and I was trying to figure out, like, what did he mean by totalities? Because it felt like that he was very clearly talking about totalities in several different senses. And so I've included here what the different ways in which I think he was using the term totality. So one is, more simply just the totality of the cybernetic individual, cognitive system in question, whether a machine or an animal. But then there's also this collective and even political totality. And then there's also the existential one, man escaping his own submission. And Dupuy includes this quote again from Simondon, that man escapes the condition of being subordinated to the finality of the whole in learning to fabricate finality. And that was this verum factum principle that we discussed that was significant in the first chapter. So in being able to, for the first time, consciously shape finality, man transcends his immemorial subordination. I don't know. I like this. I mean, I think that's a significant comment to include in the context of the history of cognitive science and cybernetics, because I think it's again still alive in, or that existential impulse to transcend our kind of subordination like that. I think that's still present in contemporary work on AI, and I think in many ways we can understand what we're trying to do there. in this existential way. Then there's also this more complicated one, and I'd really like to hear what you all have to say here, because this thing confused the heck out of me. It's mirrors and mirrors and mirrors. And so Dupuy also talks about the totality of simulacra. And I think this is to do with the confusion of models and that which is being modeled into a model, into what became a model of a model, as what we were modeling became increasingly complex. But yeah, we'll get there. But if it's messy, I apologize. Ask for help. So cybernetic totalities. Dupuy identifies basically two different kinds: the artificial totalities, which he said are nominal and made whole by a third element. So here he's talking about the cybernetic systems in question. And I was surprised, like there's a passage that shows up in a lot of places and a lot of literature that's sensitive to this history of cognitive science and cybernetics. I think it shows up in Varela and Roche and Thompson's book on the embodied mind. It shows up in Stuart Kaufman's books on oh heck, what's it called? Big fat textbook published in '93 on that brings together evolutionary theory and complexity science. And Kaufman's even mentioned later in this chapter. He had some connection to one of the biologists. I think that anyway, the chapter, the section in questions from Kant's Critique of Judgment, where he's talking about natural ends and natural purposes, and describe and to illustrate the distinction, he talks about a watch. So putting it in the terms here of is the watch a totality? And the way Kant talks about it there is like, well, it's only made whole in the mind of the person who built it. So the third element, right? So we have the parts that were kind of held together. And so it's a nominal totality or an artificial totality. And so against this, Dupuy points out the emergence of this new field in biology of embryology, where we have this question of natural totalities. And the significance of this is right, with the emergence of embryology, physics to biology becomes continuous. These aren't separate things. We don't have to posit a different methodology. We can describe these systems in the same sort of way, which is what Wiener was originally aiming to do, according to Dupuy in this chapter. And that the order that emerges and self-organizes out of chaos can be described in physicalist way and in terms and with tools of physics. So in the last chapter, there was a lot of philosophy of mind, and so the significance here is that of this emergence of embryology is that non-reductive physicalism is possible, right? We can talk about emergent order and self-organization and complexity, all the while using physicalist and mechanical language and concepts. So we can begin to talk about teleological mechanisms in a rigorous way and talk about purposive behavior in a way that satisfies the cybernetician. And then finally, well, not quite finally, one of the penultimate section on system and autonomy. The connection here is, right, as we're talking about complex systems are autonomous as a totality in a way that that the cybernetic complicated systems are not. Right? So a nervous system is a complex system. It's autonomous. It's not passive. So unlike, say, a Turing machine, it's not just waiting for input, but it's actively it's active. And that, as a he says also, right, so complex systems are or involve this hierarchy of integration and self-regulation that's thermodynamic, it's chemical and biochemical. And I wanted to point out this paper by Monteville and Mossio, these two biologists, who introduce a notion of constraint closure. And again, the notion of constraint closure comes up a lot in this context. And it's interesting. So I'm reading, I think, the Princeton version of this book, and it's the earlier one. And so it's interesting to notice that when Dupuy's writing here, there's a little passage in which he really what's the word? Not forecasts, foreshadows, or something like foretells, or something like that. This notion of constraint closure. So Dupuy says that in a system, that is to say, an organism, the laws of physics allow the individual elements a number of degrees of freedom. This indeterminacy at the lower level ends up being reduced by the constraints imposed upon it by the integrated activity of the whole. Constraints that themselves result from the composition of elementary activities. The whole and its elements therefore mutually determine each other. It is this co-determination that accounts for the complexity of living beings. So this is very close, if not identical, with the notion of autopoiesis that comes out of the second order cybernetics tradition. And so the constraint closure idea in biology, maybe you're all familiar with it, is pretty much what Dupuy says here, right? That a self-organizing system is constrains particular degrees of freedom. So if we take a cell, DNA in the cell codes for the production of proteins that build a cell wall, and that cell wall, a semi-permeable boundary, regulates the passage of biochemical and biophysical things across that boundary, and internal to the cell are further internal boundaries that basically define particular degrees of freedom for energy to be, can go this way or go that way. And those particular constraints enable the continued production of those very constraints. I mean, great idea, brilliant idea, and Dupuy was kind of already forecasting it here. Anyway, so he goes on to point out that cybernetics failed to grasp this point, basically, and this is one of my favorite phrases in the whole chapter, that the index to the transcripts of the last 5 conferences is eloquent in its silence. Right, and then I tried to summarize the last section of the chapter with this kind of single diagram concerning the challenge of models and modeling complex systems. So he talks about this threshold that we have, where on the left side, there's a threshold when we're trying to model systems of a certain complexity, and once the system we're trying to model becomes more complex than this threshold, the model itself, in order to be a viable model with fidelity, has to be appropriately complex too. And according to this threshold, on one side, the model is going to be less complicated than the machine whose behavior is modeling, and so the model is kind of useful in that sense. Turing machine, for example, as a model of human behavior, for example, we can say, right, this is a really nice, simple model, much less complicated than what's going on. And now we have computer system models of weather systems and of group populations and all these things, and the model itself becomes extraordinarily complex. And so I think then what Dupuy's trying to sort of bring attention to at the end of the chapter is this theme of when, as he says, the model takes on a certain autonomy. So he says, consider the problem of trying to model a natural object whose complexity exceeds the threshold posited by von Neumann. The model, if it is to be faithful to what it represents, must also exceed this threshold. But then it will not only be a model of its object, but also a model of itself, or rather of its own behavior. The autonomy of the model is bound to follow from the modeling of autonomous systems. It was full of danger, carrying with it the risk that man would finally lose himself in the mirror, held up by being created in his own image. So here we're trying to model ourselves, and we recognize, hey, we're complex systems. We build these AI systems as. So yeah, I think that's what he's saying, right? So that AI systems, we should remember, are in the end models of human minds and human cognition, but we're complicated or complex, I'd say, and AI systems have grown accordingly complex, such that now they themselves are these black boxes and so on that are more complex than we can really deal with any kind of, or at least have any kind of clear sense of them. And so now when we're modeling or trying to understand conceptions of intelligence, what we're really basing that on is the conception of intelligence of the AI machine, or of this complex model of the model. And so there's something here that I find really difficult to articulate in a clear way. There's just lots of mirrors. So if anyone else can do it, I'd love to hear. I think that's pretty much it. On for a while, but yeah, thanks. Hope you all enjoyed it. Oh, okay. So here I think are in the end sort of the 5 themes, if you want, of that I identified in the chapter. I don't know if they can structure the conversation now, the discussion now to come. Yep, there you go.
All right, thank you, Michael. Can you just stop the screen sharing now? Thanks. So as you see from my name, Sebastian isn't coming tonight, and I was supposed to take on his role, at least in recording and stuff, but I definitely won't be able to take on his role as a moderator, especially because I haven't been able to read through the chapters. So I propose that we just let the discussion flow as it does.
Righty. I don't know it was kind of a chunky chapter. It was 30, somewhere between 30 and 40 pages in the end. So yeah, I don't know if I've sort of accurately communicated it. Were there things that stuck out to any of you?
I think it was a good presentation. I didn't get to read the last chapter though, so I can't help you there. But I was really interested, like, so he talks about how information is like, has this conflated meanings, right? But I didn't quite get that he would define meaning in a better sense. So okay, so he talks about information being in this I don't know, material difference, difference that makes a difference way, and then meaning as in a semantic way, but like he doesn't really, and then he goes on to say, or like him and Kluwer are criticizing that this Shannon's theory of meaning is Shannon's theory of information is missing meaning in it, right? And that meaning will always kind of find its way back. But they don't really define meaning as such, right? So so I don't know, maybe others have, maybe I didn't like find it in the text, but does anybody have any idea like what would be meaning for Dupuy, for instance? Dupuy.
Do you want to answer, Michael?
Wait a sec. I'm just having a little. Remember, he says something like he passes commentary on it.
I mean, I think he's trying to like connect holism with like accounts of meaning and in a way in like this information theory being connected with more atomistic I don't know, considerations, but I don't understand why information couldn't be grasped or couldn't be framed in a holistic way, right?
What do you mean?
Well, basically that I mean, or for instance, you talked about the article that mentions Jane Austen, right? And there's two sort of information processings there, if I remember. So one was like control, which is more this information theory perspective, and the other one is communication, which is more this semantic perspective, right? But how would you comment if why couldn't communication in this sense that you described also be in a way described by information theory processing, just on a level of a I don't know, a system of language users, right? There's still there's still like utterances, you know, that at the end of the day are like vibrations in the air or something like that, you know, that acquire meaning through like through some conventions among the people that use those utterances, right? So I'm just thinking that maybe meaning for me is being like thrown around a bit without, and being used to criticize information processing without really defining well what meaning is and why couldn't it be related to information processing, albeit in like a holistic sense.
Nice. Okay, I think I'm with you. I think I'm with you. So the way I've come to understand information, like how information is understood in information theory, first is that it's purely a quantitative notion. The image that often comes to my mind is like if I imagine Morse code or something like that, or drawing, right? I draw a line, one line, and I draw another line, right? It's the same, same horizontal line, and then boom, vertical line. There's a change, a difference, and that so in pure, if there's pure uniformity, right, like a purely white canvas, there's no information there in that sense because there are no differences. And if I draw a line down the middle of that white canvas, then boom, there's suddenly two sides, I'll say. And so there's heterogeneity, there's difference now, and with information theory, it seems like it is possible to quantify the amount of difference in a way that's got nothing to do with what either of those sides or what that canvas means. And so I often think about, for example, the structure of a lot of really simple jokes is in the form of three, three men walk into a bar, an Englishman, an Irishman, and a Scotsman, or whatever, jokes of that kind of caliber, and then the first two do something, and then the third one does something different, and it makes us laugh. And three is that, like, it's no coincidence, because three is sort of the minimal number required in order to both establish a pattern and then break it. And that sort of pattern breaking is tied to kind of bits of information, where again with the dot, with the dashes or something, there's that kind of information. So there's, when Shannon talks about choice amongst possible alternatives, I think that's another important element to bring in. That, for example, again, if we're using this line drawing thing, this horizontal and vertical line drawing thing, if I say that, right, there are lines of two kinds, horizontal and vertical, there are two options, right? And this is the same thing that comes up in with the notion of a bit. It can be a 0 or a 1, so two options, and the difference between that corresponds to 1 bit. So because there's only one choice, and so and that there's only, and that's the minimal quantity, right? If we scale that up then, and we look at the Mona Lisa, or if we look at Moritz's psychedelic picture, there are a million different colors, a million different lines and shapes, a million different possible choices, and ways that lines could be drawn, colors that could be taken, and then we include the depth of it, right? And the differences that make a difference become three-dimensional. And all of this is possible to talk about in a quantitative way that's completely independent of what the Mona Lisa means to me, or what the three men walking into the bar means to me. I don't know, that's kind of how I've understood information theory and what it's trying to do, and why it's really separate from more meaning in the more usual sense that we understand it. I don't know, does that make sense? I don't know if anyone wants to, maybe I've missed something, maybe I'm wrong. Am I understanding?
No, I think that was good, Michael. Yeah, I was thinking along the same lines when Ella asked the question, like to build up on your example, like if you have like a picture with one line, like two sides, so this would have one bit of information, just like a coin, right? Mm-hmm. So you have a coin and you have this separated picture. And I think here you can see that, I mean, if you apply the notion of information, you get the same quantity, but those are two different things. And meaning, I think, for Dupuy would be like knowing how to differentiate among qualitatively different phenomena, right? I mean, that would be one sense, like you can apply the same measure of information to totally different things. So how can you say that this captures something essential to it, right? And the other would be like, maybe if you think of like information as choosing between alternatives. Here again, in the sense of behavior, right? So meaning, I guess, would be that reason why you chose a particular action, not just, I mean, it's the same quantity of information, whether you see this action or that action, but one was chosen because of a particular interest or structure of the organism, right? So this would be, I guess, I think, this like line of reasoning.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would agree that meaning is fundamentally like linked to like a totality in a way, be it an organism. So meaning is present for an organism or for like larger systems, I don't know, societies. But I mean, it still seems that information science still can capture some really complex meaning systems, just by way of like sort of this Morse code principles, right? I mean, for instance, the latest hype of large language models, right?
Yeah, but that's not information science. I mean, I don't think the notion of information has much to do with that at all.
Why not?
No, that's computer science, but you shouldn't conflate, like, they're not applying the notion of information to, like, that doesn't really, it's not a tool they're using for modeling language, right?
I mean, meaning in large language model of a word is basically connected to its occurrence. So in the informational value of its occurrence in a context. So they're basically formalizing meaning by way of in a way some sort of surprisal. So how surprising a word is, or how unsurprising it is, because large language models are basically are trained on one particular task, and that is like prediction of the next word or prediction of whatever word in a context. And so you would try to minimize surprise by, and that's the way large language models learn, right? They try to minimize the surprise of a word being in a given context by seeing like a whole bunch of other of contexts and language and texts. So in a way, I would say that large language models are of course connected with information theory.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. Yes.
And the question is, so these large language models, I mean, I wouldn't say they capture meaning in a way. They quantify meaning very well, which is shown in their like also being able to produce extremely meaningful conversations with human participants, right? But I wouldn't say that they're like really producing meaning in this sense that they are not a self-sustaining totality, right? So it's not meaningful for the large language model, which operates in a way on this co-occurrence statistics in information processing without having any sort of desires, goals, or ability to like apply this information in a meaningful way to the world, in a way.
100%, I think. I really like the distinction between it's not meaningful for them, for the large language model. It's not the associations that they're making are not meaningful for them in the sense that we conventionally understand meaning. They're obviously meaningful for them as a system in the sense that there's a particular relationship between input and output and so on, and that affects particular actions and so on. But yeah, there's two nice things going on, I think, here for me, or two nice distinctions here for me. One is this control and communication thing, and then the other is, well, who's it meaningful for? And as sort of natural totalities in the language of the book, we interpret meaning on our own terms, and things and signals and information takes on meaning that it does for us on our own terms. But we, as builders of large language models, for example, define the ways in which it is to interpret meaning. And so the meaning and then the output is also like meaningful to us, right? An image generation system doesn't give a damn about its output or the significance of the piece it created, even if it moves a whole generation of humans to tears.
I mean,
so,
I
yeah.
still, sorry.
Sorry, go for it.
I just thought that, like, still, I think there is some evidence that language processing in humans is also, I mean, in one sense describable as some sort of, I mean, or could be in a way imagined as some sort of very, 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 very complex information processing of this sort. For instance, like brain measuring surprisal or something, I don't know, of the next word. And there are some evidence that like points to that direction. But yeah, again, I would say that this would be describing maybe like the vehicle of meaning, like, so brain processing and maybe even like communication on a level of a group, but perhaps it wouldn't be really getting at the heart of what meaning or how meaning emerges. So even if you could describe like people exchanging utterances in a very information processing way, there's an intuition that something would be missing, right? That it's not that, but I don't think that this intuition is should be like taken just by saying it's holistic. I mean, I think you can be more precise in describing what does it mean that meaning is holistic in this sense, right?
Can you keep on going?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure I have an answer to it. I just think that maybe it's not. It's to be critical of information processing because it's not like, I don't know, because it's not relevant for humans. I don't think that's necessarily correct. I mean, it might be a good system to describe how humans communicate, but describe only on a certain level without necessarily, like, again, then you can build systems that maybe reproduce this behavior, but it seems as though something is missing, and this something is fundamentally connected with a system being able to take meaning, so to, I guess, make meaning as an organism in the world, right? So it almost it would seem that meaning is fundamentally connected with embodiment in this way of being an adaptive system in an environment, right?
Yeah, I like that like, okay, there's something it's missing, but there's also something that is getting. That's I think what I hear you saying, and I'm thinking now about, I can't remember whether it was Wiener or von Neumann, the one who was working on anti-aircraft weapons systems. And the amount of information that it's having to integrate, given the velocity of the aircraft and the velocity of the rounds, and trying to ensure that they kind of meet somewhere in the sky to achieve the goal or execute the task. The coordination internal to that machine is going to be pretty sophisticated. I think with Wiener in particular, in his cybernetics book, my impression now is that really the sense of information is really valuable for talking about the coordination of a system. So how, if I'm trying to type on the computer or catch a ball or whatever, just that I need to coordinate my body with my percepts and so on with what I perceive, that information theory is really good for describing that kind of thing. And we see that in machines, that there needs to be, as Shannon says, you know, this exact or approximate reproduction of a signal between 2 points, right? Like if my left arm and my right arm is if the signal that's being propagated between them across my nervous system isn't really high fidelity, I'm going to be an uncoordinated mess. And information theory is really good at describing that kind of sense of choice amongst the possible alternatives, like different at each stop along the way of my nervous system, the different ways that the signal could be interpreted, propagated, and so on. Yeah, I think information, you're right, theory is really good at describing that kind of thing. And I like to call that control information, because I'm talking about control and coordination of my body. And the more general sense of meaning, information in the meaning sense, like that's not going to help me understand the basic coordination challenges of my body, or how do we build robotic systems or autonomous systems. So yeah, I like that. And one of the things that comes out of it is like, oh, what do we want then from, you know, what are we trying to do? Because you know, we've achieved a lot of kind of techno-scientific success with building machines according to that kind of information theoretic understanding of information that continuously seems to lack the meaning, the conventional sense of information, right? But it works, right? We build robotic systems and autonomous AI systems that make a ton of money. And so the model in that way sort of has a certain validated and verified status, and one which, meaning in its conventional sense, like we couldn't build systems based on based on semantics. I don't think. I wouldn't know how to do that. So yeah, we need. I know, yeah, you've inspired me to remember that. Heck, okay, it's easy to bash information theory, but there's something important about it. I mean, and maybe that's one way of understanding Dupuy's like mirrors of models that we've gone, okay, this approach to modeling intelligence and cognition is successful, and therefore we should believe it. And then the model kind of takes on a certain autonomy, starts to run by itself, and starts to influence our conceptions of what we think intelligence and cognition is, because we're like, well, hey, there's this verified model, and so now we're modeling intelligence and cognition on the model itself, on the original model. And we kind of lose sight of the place of, I don't know, a bit dramatic, but like we lose sight of our humanity and the place of these other things, like the meaning in the conventional sense. I don't know, that's me trying to grasp this mirror thing, that models and models and models are getting lost in, and what's a model and what's real, and so on. A man would finally lose himself in the mirror held up by being created in his own image. That last sentence of the chapter. Okay. I'll put it as a question. Do we think that AI is a model that we've confused for reality, sort of in the way that Dupuy, as I've understood and seems to be suggesting, right, that like the model, we're now modeling the model rather than modeling ourselves? Do we think AI as a model and kind of run away from the origin a bit?
I really like the Simondon like insertions, and I mostly like agree with them, but like I think you included it also in your presentation. So this understanding of a totality as man being able to grasp that he is in a totality, but also like change it, right? So and manufacture it to his own will in a way. But I'm not sure, like this is on the page 128 in my book, and it's, for me it's kind of confusing because I think Dupuy is kind of against this sort of artificial totalities, or like tries to portray them as not real totalities, not natural, because like, so cybernetic totalities are always artificial totalities in which the parts are prior to the whole. And I'm wondering why this should be so, or like, is there a point in which an artificial totality could be interpreted as a totality in this emergent sense, not as being a totality that is imposed by an observer? So like there are some parts, and then a human observer kind of applies a totality upon it, right? But that actually the system starts to perform as a totality. And I think in AI there has not been really such a totality yet. But I'm not sure why there wouldn't be a possibility of it, for instance, so that there would be some kind of a self-organizing totality which would be artificial, like artificially produced. And that, I think, would be then this, what you're talking about, so that it would like almost have a life of its own in a way, and it would start to influence how we think about ourselves as well, right? But for now, I don't think that AI has reached this sort of goal. I don't know, maybe others can comment.
The way I've understood what he calls kind of artificial and natural totalities, or nominal totalities, is, as you say, this is sort of the role of the observer. And importantly, I think, and it's not something he seems to talk about here, but importantly, or that the role of the observer plays a massive role in the distinction between cybernetics and second order cybernetics, doesn't it? So this, I don't know, that's something I can want to hold in mind here as you think about.
Can someone explain the notion of totality, how Dupuy uses it here? Because I'm a bit confused. Like, is it just a kind of a wholeness, or like?
And that's how I've understood it. Oh, I don't know about you, Ella.
I mean, I haven't. I think I stopped like in the middle of this chapter, so that's a problem. But at least in the beginning, he's kind of so being critical. Like he says, like you could maybe interpret cybernetics as kind of a union between like holistic philosophy and modern science, but you would be mistaken, because what cybernetics is trying to do is not real like holism, real totalities, they're artificial totalities, and those are not ones where the whole becomes comes before its parts, but where you could reconstruct the whole from its parts, or something like that. Although I'm not sure why this would be the case, because you can still have like an interdependence, right, between the whole and its part, even in artificial systems, probably. Because also he kind of quotes all of these so there were like critics of cybernetics that were like kind of fascinated by, I don't know, these descriptions of holistic entities, like from Ashby's automata or whatnot, but they were at the end still like dismissive towards them. So these are not real totalities, these are not real holisms. And so, okay, so this is, I specifically like underlined this because it was, for me, kind of weird, because he said, cybernetic totalization is not holistic. It is an artificial holism, a simulation of holism whose purpose is to demystify it. And I would say, well, it's good to demystify things. But here it kind of sounds as though this would be kind of a bad thing. That this is why it's not real totality. But correct me if I'm mistaken.
Well, he says, like somewhere else, he says that it's that like the parts are prior to the whole, but that's like a sign of not being a real totality, something like that. But I'm not sure what it is.
That's like that's where he quotes Simondon, so like 128 in like the third chapter. But what would that even mean, and why couldn't, what would it mean for I don't know, wait, I have to think about it a bit.
It is a chewy sentence. I have to chew on it a bit to make sense of it. So I think, I don't know, the way I'm understanding it, cybernetic totality, cybernetic things we can now, I guess.
Can you just talk into like the mic, because it's like trying to, it's,
Is that
the
better?
information is getting lost.
Okay, is that better?
Yeah.
So yeah, the way I understand it, cybernetic totality, cybernetic entities, wholes, individuals. It's an artificial holism because these things don't emerge naturally out of natural systems, but they're things that we build and we put together, and that you know, as Kant says, these things exist as wholes in our minds. Like the watch doesn't exist without a conception thereof to build such a thing. And it's therefore a simulation of holism, right? That I'm going to try and model a human. I'm going to try and simulate a human or a mind. It's a simulation of a holism whose purpose is to demystify it. So I'm trying to understand this mysterious thing we call mind, and I'm going to try and simulate it. And what I build in order to try and simulate it is this cybernetic system. But the cybernetic system is an artificial holism, and it's not. So I've not reproduced the whole. I've simulated it, and that simulation is what makes it artificial. I don't know, maybe that's kind of an easy and simple and overly simple interpretation of it, but that's so we're trying to, yeah.
I mean, I think he's trying to still imply that because it is a simulation and because it is an artificial holism, it then it does not have the characteristic feature of a like totality where a whole would influence its parts. Like, and I am not sure why this goes from the fact that something is an artificial. So totality, artificial whole, why then this couldn't be understood in having this characteristic of the whole still influencing its parts.
I have an idea. I'm not sure if Dupuy actually means this, but maybe in the sense that like the wholeness that which he's after is the kind of wholeness which produces itself, like continuously regenerates itself. And if it's a kind of, if it's an artificial wholeness which requires some outside agent to be able to create it and maintain it, then it's not the kind of wholeness which emerges naturally, like by itself, spontaneously, right? So this is, I think, probably his drawback. But I mean, I would totally agree with you, Ella, that this is, I mean, I don't find this convincing, because like what about artificial life? Like you set up like some structure, and then this structure goes on to have like a life of its own. So this would be, in my opinion, an autonomous system, even though it's artificial in a sense, right? So.
Yeah, precisely. I agree with that.
What I don't know, there's something that I'm still, there's something that's still not quite right about artificial life for me in this regard. It's hard to point to. I'm wondering something like this, that so we create the conditions for artificial life. So, and then in that respect, right, it's a simulation rather than a reproduction. And whilst it's like a higher fidelity simulation by virtue of it being able to kind of maintain itself and reproduce itself, right? You know, artificial life on computer simulations or in chemistry sets or something like that. I'm kind of thinking out loud here. I don't have a worked out idea about it. Yeah, I'm like, oh, there's something that, because I appreciated your point. Okay, artificial life reproduces the things or simulates the things that we would say are necessary. That we would say are necessary for being a natural totality. But I think I would want to say that artificial life is still an artificial totality because we're creating the conditions for its existence, and in the end, it's still a simulation rather than a reproduction. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong, and I'm sure.
Yeah, I'm talking about like a hypothetical artificial light that would actually be not the kinds of things we have now, but like an actual artificial life where you have like a whole organism able to survive on its own afterwards, right? So in that sense, I think I couldn't argue against the notion that this is a proper totality. But it's interesting to think about other examples, such as like cellular automata and stuff like that, where you have like a totally different kind of environment, but you have some isomorphisms such that you could claim that it's an autonomous system in a sense, but it's a totally different kind, like maybe existing in some virtual space in some supercomputer or whatever. That would be like that. Actually, this kind kinds of reasoning actually confuses me. I mean, I don't have a good opinion on whether or not I would call this living or a totality or not.
Yeah, I've been also thinking, because I was watching like the author, that the biologist that we mentioned in the previous session, so Michael Levin, and so they did an experiment where I think I don't remember really, but they take a bunch of like cells of the skin, I think. Maybe they did differentiate. I'm not sure what they do to them, but like these cells that were supposed to be skin, right? So they had a sort of a destined function. They form like these small clusters of cells that start to move around, and in a way, if you leave like other cells on the like petri dish, these clusters of cells will try to like, they will move in circles, and they will cluster other cells together, forming new clusters that can move on their own in a way, right? And it's really interesting to think, so where would this be on the like scale of life and artificial life, or like because I mean, it's obviously, it still uses cells which are living organisms, right? They're still, it's not like making sort of this organismic behavior from scratch, but still it's like repurposing something in a way that starts to emit some sort of autonomic behavior, and so I think like there are these fringe cases and I think more will be like discovered, where like you can kind of, at least if not produce artificial life, at least from scratch, really reconfigure what life means in this sense, right? What can form a totality and what yeah, I don't know. And maybe what I wanted to say also is that like evolution this is not something that this little automaton in a way of cells is not something that was like produced in nature, right? It's still it's kind of a mixture of us artificially like tweaking mechanisms that have evolved already.
That's pretty that's pretty cool. the experiment.
Yeah, I think you should just like watch his lectures, because they're just like I mean, really fun to watch also, but pretty mind-boggling.
It has me the way the trajectory of our conversation is going. It has me thinking about what's it called, this Euthyphro dilemma. I think it's one of Plato's dialogues, where I think it's the one where Socrates is asking about, are the gods pious, or I can't remember which way around is, but the generalized question is like, is the thing in question kind of real, or is it a feature or an expression of our attempt to make sense of the real? And so, and that question feels very present to me when we're trying to draw this line between life and cognitive systems and totalities, and what sort of where we want to draw that line in that regard. There's something about self-producing, self-organizing systems. I don't know. I don't know, just has me, I guess, thinking that like, oh, just a return to a perennial sort of question in a really modern form. I like a little below what you quoted there. Another Simondon insertion. Life was confused with finality. I wonder if that's.
Yeah. Sorry, to finish your
Go
thought.
for it.
I was just thinking about Simondon and how it's interesting that Dupuy uses him pretty, quite a lot, because this relates to this discussion about totality. I think Simondon is a very kind of untotalitarian philosopher. I mean, he, like this book, Individuation in Light of Notion of Forms and Information, is actually like criticizing this notion that you should consider cognitive agents or humans as totalities. And basically, his point is that, I mean, in some sense, I think understanding, like, let's say, a notion such as autopoiesis is a kind of precondition for understanding Simondon, because what he's saying is this: like, you should think of cognition as a kind of totality striving to maintain itself, but always kind of failing. And with this, or maybe not failing, because this is a kind of, it's not a bug, it's a feature of life, that where you are striving to maintain a certain structure, you will come into contact with the environment. And the environment is not only a source of perturbation, but also a source of like information, like it's forming you into something else continuously, right? So you have certain parameters which you strive to maintain, but these parameters change as you go along, as you go on living. So this, you could think of this in terms of like a process of evolution, right? So life has some encoding of some features in its DNA, but through process of evolution, through like continual, like throughout generations, this encoding changes, right? And it changes, let's say, I mean, this is a feature of life. It's a feature that helps life evolve to become better adapted to face some problems. So it's not just the mutations are not just some sort of errors in transcription. It's actually a feature of life, right? It's a feature of cognition in the sense. So in the same sense, you could think about like even throughout the lifetime of an individual organism, when you have like a central nervous system, you could have the same kind of dynamics. At least this is Simondon's point. Like, it's about maintaining certain dynamics, let's say, within your nervous system. But learning is precisely this kind of process where these internally generated patterns change throughout the course of your lifetime to adapt to certain new problems. So in this sense, you are continually becoming like something, a different structure. So that would be like, I guess, I don't know whether this fits with Dupuy's, I mean, it's definitely kind of related to this, the problems we've been discussing, right? But I also relate to his notion of information, right? So this is his point. If you also mentioned this quotation where he says that it's like a changing of form. That's his point, right? So information for him is receiving information is you as a form are being changed, and this is like a process of learning, of acquiring information, right? Yeah, that was it. Sorry, go ahead.
That's good. This reading group did Simondon's stuff on individuation, right? A few
Not yet, but
iterations ago now.
now it's forthcoming. I think it's the
Oh.
next iteration that we're going to do that.
Ah, okay. Because I only came across Simondon a few years ago, and like it, I've got his 2 books on individuation here, and I tried to start them. I was like, holy heck, I'm gonna need to focus on this, and it's like, okay, this is a later project. But I think I encountered him in the work of Weaver and Vitas, these guys at the university in Brussels, and they have a paper. It's called On the Individuation of Intelligent Agents, open-ended individuation of intelligent agents. And I think it was there that I first encountered Simondon, because they reference him a bunch in the paper. And they make a very interesting point, if I remember it right, that like prior to needing to solve a problem, we have to account for the individuation of the intelligent agent in the first place. And that and then connecting it to this chapter, right? Prior to the cybernetic system solving a problem or cognizing or whatever, we have to account for its individuation. Like how do we recognize it as a totality? Is it artificial, is it natural, and so on, and all that stuff we've been talking about? And in that paper, these 2 chaps, they kind of say, like, when we talk about intelligence as this kind of problem-solving capacity, we take the individuation of the agent for granted, and so it becomes possible to talk about artificial and natural totalities in the same sort of way, right? That we're both solving problems, and then there's this kind of isomorphism again. But it's just kind of interesting, some of the pieces coming together here, where like, because as I've understood it, one of the significant things about the move to second order cybernetics is precisely that question of like, how is the system the cybernetic totality of the individual, the entity, individuated, right? It recognizes the role of the observer in individuating a system, or the system self-individuating. Yeah, I think I'm basically just saying, oh, I'm attracted to what I've seen and heard of Simondon's work, and it seems, I don't know, appropriate, given what we've been exploring here, like the difference between totalities, artificial and natural, and the significance of that distinction. Yeah, like why does it matter? Yeah, what do we think? Why does it matter if it's an artificial or a natural totality?
I have to go slowly, but it was a very interesting discussion. I think, yeah, it seems as though Simondon would be really relevant for the discussion, but I haven't read him also. Maybe for the next reading.
Highly recommending.
Okay, so see you in 2 weeks, at least some of you. Bye.
So
Ciao.
I realized I just opened another bag there, so I'm happy to call it a day as well.
Yeah. I mean, we've gone probably long enough. Maybe Isaac, are you still with us?
Yes, I am, but I wasn't really prepared today. But it was a really nice discussion, so thank you.
Okay. Well, yeah. So you agree? Yeah, we can wrap this up. and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Alrighty. Thanks. Thanks a
Ciao.
lot. Ciao.